Welcome back to Global Trials Accelerators, the podcast where we dismantle the barriers to clinical innovation and explore the strategies driving the next generation of life-saving therapies. Here is the stark reality facing cardiovascular care today. While fewer patients are dying of acute heart attack compared to decades ago, cases of advanced chronic heart failure are surging. The sickest among these patients really rely on high complex class 3 devices such as implantable blood pumps, mechanical circulators, and cardiac contractility modulation systems. Given the risk and technical challenges involved in developing these technologies, the transition from first-in-human study into everyday clinical adoption is arguably one of the most demanding journeys in all of medtech. My guest today has walked through that journey from both sides of the table. Dr. Deborah Morley began her career as a cardiovascular physiologist studying failing heart mechanisms in the lab and teaching medicine and pharmacology. She then transitioned into the industry, spending decades leading clinical, regulatory, and quality operations from Class 3 cardiovascular devices, taking complex systems through IDE, PMA, CMARC, and into the real world. Today, she serves as Director of Cardiovascular Strategy Delivery and co-leader of the Cardiovascular Center for Excellence at Global CRO RQM+. Dr. Morley, welcome to the Global Trial Accelerator Show. It's a real privilege to have you with us.
Thank you. I look forward to our conversation.
Dr. Morley, I would like to start at the beginning. Back in the lab, you started as a cardiovascular physiologist doing grant-funded research and slowly studying the intricacies of heart failure. What was it about the physiology of failing hearts that captured your attention and kept your entire career dedicated to this particular space?
That's a great question. I think there were several aspects of heart failure that attracted me to study this area. One is that early in my career, I was working with a cardiology group, and many of the patients that we saw were younger. They had cardiomyopathies, um, some with the run-of-the-mill ischemic heart disease and coronary artery disease, but many had disease of the heart muscle, the myocardium, that couldn't be explained, or that was a result of things like viral insult, alcoholic cardiomyopathy, peripartum cardiomyopathies. So I saw a lot of young people really, really suffering, and became very intrigued because of my physiology background in how the heart muscle responded to these various insults, but more how we could use, and initially it was primarily medications, but devices to alter that physiology and see improvement in these patients. The devices, initially were very large. They were like, left ventricular assist devices, and they really just were replacing the pump action. But in 2026, those devices have come a long way. The ventricular assist devices that are available are much smaller with fewer complications. And now we have devices to really give the clinician a picture of what the physiology is. And so we're able to impact not only the patient's clinical status, but really how they feel, their quality of life, and what they're able to do. So in short, it was studying the ultimate pump, the heart, and that's really how I got into uh, my expertise in ventricular assist devices and mechanical circulatory support, because my love, what I really enjoyed studying was the physiology of the heart. And a blood pump really has to be designed in a way that it either complements or mimics that action. And that's a real challenge. And finally, I really loved heart failure because you can see such an improvement in patients with the device therapies that you provide. I remember, very distinctly a patient we had in a study that I was doing in Switzerland. And it was a young man, 18, 19 years old, who had idiopathic dilated cardiomyopathy, uh, was really end stage, really was not going to survive. And we were able to implant this device that we had been working on for several years and trying to refine. And, 6, 7 days later, the young man was up in bed and asking for a Coke. And so it really makes a difference. And that's what it's all about for me.
The potential behind the therapy. That's
Exactly.
wonderful, doctor. And speaking of that potential, you had a thriving academic foundation teaching medicine, running research programs, and then you made a jump that many academics contemplate, but few actually pull off, stepping directly into industry. What was that catalyst that made you walk away from the academic faculty purely and then step into the corporate, regulatory, and clinical domain?
I think it's something that most young scientists face, and that's the availability of funding. At the academic institution that I was at, I was teaching and I was doing research, but teaching doesn't provide revenue for the institution. And I had NIH grants, but when that funding ran out, getting additional grant funding at the time was very, very difficult. And the institution was honest with me. They could not continue to support a role for pure research and teaching without significant external funding. So, right about that time, we had started a LVAD study. This was very early in the days of LVAD studies. And I was the coordinator for the study, the clinical coordinator for the study at our university, at our medical school. The company reached out to me and said, how would you like to come and be our senior clinical scientist? Um, Manage our PMA submission and our clinical programs. And really, the option made sense to me at the time. So I jumped in. I was very, very fortunate to have a mentor at the company that could help me make the transition from academics to industry. I think it's a really hard transition for most people. And actually, I think you see this in the medical device industry where you have a number of founders and new CEOs who come from academics and really fail to thrive in the environment, largely because I think they are looking at the studies and what needs to be done, from a purely scientific perspective, when you transition to industry, the science is important. It's very important. But just as important are the business goals, and what you can realistically do with the resources that you have, and what you have to execute in certain time frames in order to continue to get investors, attract investors, and get funding, for your company, particularly in the startup environment, which is where I specialize. This is true. And I've seen a lot of companies fail because they have very wonderfully designed studies, scientifically solid, and really would make a New England Journal of Medicine paper, but they aren't going to make it in industry where the deliverables are now, where the deliverables are on a time frame. In academics, you could always say, well, I am going to take a sabbatical, or, so and so's on vacation, so we're not going to get it done. It doesn't fly in business. You have to find a solution and make it happen.
That was going to be my question, doctor. Like, in that transition, if there were any habits or lessons that you had to unlearn quickly as you move into the corporate world of class 3 devices. But I believe you've answered that question. Anything you would like to add to someone that's contemplating to do that shift in their career?
I think the thing that I would add is that it's absolutely a great move, because particularly getting in the startup environment, because it allows you to use all of your scientific knowledge in so many different ways. Designing studies, working with engineers to help them understand how the patient responds. Because a lot of the engineers have never seen a patient, and they don't know that, this little tweak in the device is going to result in shutting down the circulation in a patient. So being able to provide that. And then learning the business landscape, learning that how to define goals and meet timelines, all are adjustments that you have to make, but it's absolutely worth it in the end, because so much more, I think, than in academics, you see the results of your work. You see things come to fruition um, much more clearly. You're there when the device goes in the patient. It's not a research grant that you contributed to and defined what the properties of such and such were. It's you were part of building that device, and you were part of deciding what patient population was best for that device, and you were part of selling it to physicians, and you were there when it was implanted, and you can't beat that.
Very exciting. Thank you, doctor. And speaking of that involvement, your career is particular in that sense. Most careers in industry drift from smaller, less established companies to bigger ones that are more established, bigger organizations. Your path ran inverse to that. You started in the big corporate program and then migrated towards the startup, working on progressively smaller, earlier stage blood pumps. What did operating on that agile, cash sensitive startup edge teach you that the big corporate medtech simply couldn't?
With the big corporate med tech, your role was, first of all, more isolated. So you had a specific function and you did that function, but when it all came together, you weren't necessarily as involved. And in the same way, the impact of funding and resource allocation was a couple of levels away from you. So you didn't feel that so much. But getting into the startups, particularly in the way that I joined, where I was the second or third employee in the company, you were there from the very beginning. So while you were hired to do clinical and regulatory, you were there at the beginning before those programs were started. So you had a role in the concept. You had a role in how design was going to occur. Um, you played a role in preclinical testing. You went from there to get regulatory approvals and for first in human and design first in human studies and make decisions about at what point a device is ready for first in human. That's a very difficult and important decision. And you played a part in that. And then you were there when the device went in the first patient. And you saw the company grow. You were part of that. You developed a full blown regulatory and clinical team. You designed the studies, you defended it to the regulatory authorities. Um, you were responsible for reporting all of the adverse events and the vigilance. And so you saw the problems and you had to come up with solutions or the company, just went away. So you had that. And you also had it's pressure, but it's also good pressure from your, CEO and your investors and your board to show results. And as a scientist originally, you had to walk the fine line between ensuring that one, the science was respected, that the regulations weren't violated. You're not going to let a company, regardless of how excited the investors are, do something that is not allowed or unsafe to patients. That you're just not going to let happen. And you have to think of how you're going to put this all together in the end to drive adoption, because regulatory approval is not enough. That's really only the beginning of the story. And you have to be able to bring it to the end. And in my role as clinical and regulatory, and with my scientific background, a lot of what I was called upon to do was to represent, the clinical credibility of the company and the device and the studies and the patients. And I think that's very, very important. But I always had to be and was cognizant of how that played out in the boardroom.
So that sense of ownership and involvement and uh, being part of the decision making process was what it's what I'm listening you explain, and how that has a impact in the whole spread of the endeavor. And speaking of that, about the unique reality of the class 3 implantable devices, there are life sustaining and therefore high risk technologies where the evidence bar is immense. For the developers listening who may be transitioning from a low risk device, what makes class 3 cardiovascular pathway a fundamentally different pathway rather than just a quote unquote harder version of class 2. Can you help us understand that a little bit deeper, please?
Sure, that's a good question. I think the first clarification that I want to make is that class 3 doesn't mean that it's life sustaining. Not all class 3 devices are life sustaining. Many are, like ventricular assist devices, respiratory support devices, uh, liver perfusion devices are life sustaining. But class 3 is really just about the risk. So they're high risk. And I think the transition that people have difficulty understanding when coming from, say, a class 2 device to a class 3 device is the level of evidence that's required. The requirements are the same. You still have to show in the EU safety and performance and the US safety and effectiveness. But the degree of evidence that you have to show is different. The bar is higher, obviously, for class 3 devices. So you have to factor in the additional time that it might take to do the bench preclinical studies that are required. You have to factor in you have to factor in your design, first of all, things that are going to be absolutely critical, like having a fail-safe system. So if you have a pump that might fail, then perhaps you need a hand crank or something that's going to allow it to function. And if you don't have that kind of stuff, the regulators are going to say, "Hey, you're not ready to go in humans." Another example is alarm systems. Many device manufacturers forget about things like that, but when you're talking about a high risk device, those kinds of systems are not optional. It's not something that you can say, that's a nice to have, and we'll design it in and include it in a second iteration of the device. You can't do that with the higher risk class 3 devices. At the get go, you have to have some form of those kinds of uh, safety measures incorporated into the device. And you've got to be able to show the regulators that they actually work when you say they will work. I think one thing that is often forgotten in, it kind of a small segue here is human factors and usability testing that's required for any medical device, but particularly for class 3 devices. And part of that is showing that you have an alarm or a fail-safe system, and that when it's activated, the people who are going to use the device actually can know from whatever information they get what it is they're supposed to do to take care of the patient. I'm not sure that everyone developing a device thinks through that far and to that granularity that you really have to do with the class 3 devices, particularly when they're implantable.
That's very insightful, doctor. Thank you. And in the process of guiding that platform from the very beginning, the full life cycle of the device, or the bringing the device to market from ID, PMA, the CE mark, and even post market. Looking across all that chain, all those steps in the process, where do programs most frequently break down? Is it a flaw in the core science, or is it friction at the seams between each one of those stages? Or perhaps the regulatory strategy or even maybe the real world commercialization of the device? Where do you see the process breaking down most often?
Interestingly, I see, in my colleagues, we see the process breaking down most frequently at the very beginning, before they get to IDE, before they get to PMA, before they get to CE Mark. And the issues are, first of all, knowing what your device can do, not dreaming what your device can do, but actually building a device and knowing what its functions and what its performance is. We have lots of people come to us and say, we have a device and it's going to be able to do this and this, or it can do this, this, and this. And my first question is, can you build the device? That's not a given. Um, and then where issues come up is defining what they want in terms of target patients, selecting a patient population that makes sense with what your device can do, one, but perhaps more importantly, is something that adds to uh, medical care today, something that can be adopted. You can go through and develop a device that checks all of the lists, and it's safe enough, you can get an IDE, and you can do a pivotal study and get all of the data and demonstrate that it's safe and effective in a specific patient population. But if it's not a patient population where there's a clinical need, or it's not, it doesn't do something that physicians think they need in their repertoire, or they need to better treat their patients, then it's not going to get adopted, let alone reimbursed. And, you can have the coolest device in the world, and without clinician and physician adoption and reimbursement, your company's going to die. Your device is going to die. It's going nowhere. And you really have to think about those things and plan for those things at the very beginning. If you're starting those conversations and you're starting to think about that when you get to the IDE, God forbid the PMA, you're way too late.
That brings us to the major theme of your work, from my perspective, which is design for clinical adoption. A startup can clear PMA, get the press release, and still fail commercially because physicians don't adopt the device or payers won't reimburse it, as you just alluded to. Uh, what what do you think are the hurdles that live past that regulatory approval stage that actually dictate whether a cardiovascular innovation succeeds in clinic? Is there any specifics that you could point towards?
I think it comes back to what I was alluding to, and that you have to get key physicians involved at the beginning. So when you're designing your device, when you're talking about what population you're going to study in your IDE trial or your pivotal trial, if you're not consulting physicians who know what's going on in the field, who are treating patients as part of it, then you're losing out, because you're not going to see where clinical adoption is really going to take off later on. I think the second thing that happens very often is IDE trials are designed without thinking about reimbursement. It's well known that FDA and CMS have different evidence requirements. And if you don't design your study to address both of those evidence requirements, you get to the PMA and you may have satisfied FDA, but CMS comes back and says, you need to do this, or we need to see more clinical data. So I think that's really the take-home message is you've got to involve physicians. You've got to design studies with reimbursement and safety and effectiveness in mind. You've got to design for FDA and CMS. And I want to put a plug in. I think it's critically important in the US that founders and device companies take advantage of the pre-submission process that FDA has. It makes 100% sense to talk to FDA about your plans, what you plan to test, what patients you plan to study before you jump into the study. People worry about whether or not they're going to lose time by doing a pre-submission. My philosophy is you lose a lot more time when you get to the PMA and FDA says you didn't do it right. So taking advantage of the pre-submission process, I think, is critically important. In Europe, there are now beginning to be ways that you can have consultations with expert panels, where you can have more interaction with notified bodies. So they're coming. The other thing that I think is very important and that is helpful to people in the US is the early feasibility study process. That can be very helpful. And there's a push now, an initiative where they are trying to bring that type of structure to the European arena. So I think all of those things, it's a continuum process. It's not something that you either can do in parts or that you can say, well, I'll think about how clinicians are going to use this later on. It's something that you start in the beginning, and it's a dynamic process because as you learn more about the device, as you do more patients and learn how it's used, you refine the device, you refine the patient population, you learn from the clinicians. So it's a dynamic process, but I think the biggest thing I see in sponsors is not looking at the big picture and how everything fits together. Rather, they silo on different parts and say, man, I got the IDE, we're ready to go. I mean, this is a success and everything's going to be beautiful. You could do a study and have the totally wrong population or collect data that's useless to CMS, and you have a problem.
Yes, indeed. I want to go down on a tangent, take advantage of your comments about the EU, and then we'll be back to the to the conversation we're having, which is very, very engaging for me. But given how dramatically the EU MDR has altered the European regulatory climate, how has the US versus outside US first in human decision change in the cardiovascular space for founders that are engaged in that early stage of development? Have you seen a shift in their perspective about doing inside the US versus outside?
Yes. When I first started in medical devices many years ago, it was a given fact that you didn't do first in man in the US. I mean, the regulatory hurdles were just too great. So you did first in human in Europe usually. That was where you could get your ethics committee approvals faster. It's shifted over the years. I think first going to Eastern Europe or Latin America, South America. And I think now the shift is back toward the US because of the EFS process. Getting an IDE for an EFS is not getting approval for a pivotal study. FDA understands that the device may undergo iteration after the EFS. They understand that the specific patient population you test in the EFS may change when you get into the pivotal. And at least in the experiences and interactions that I've had with FDA, it's been a process that's been valuable because it has been a back and forth. And I think the onus and the stress of doing first in human in the U.S. has, I don't want to say it's reduced because you still have the same evidence requirements, but the ability to study your device and the ability to get approval to do an EFS or first in human is now, I think, harder in the EU with the MDR than it is in the US. And I think this is evidence. I was recently at New York Valves, and you saw that, for example, in the tricuspid space, where there's a plethora of new devices coming out, and there was an entire section on the design of EFS studies for the various new technologies. So it has shifted. And I think that, my advice to colleagues now is to consider U.S. EFS studies in your discussions with your investors and your board and your team. Some companies still feel like going to Eastern Europe is easier. It may be going to South America and Latin America may be easier, but my concerns there revolve around ensuring that the standard of care is the same. Because if the standard of care is not similar to the US and you can't prove that, then FDA is going to resist accepting that data. Theoretically, they do accept OUS data in support of a PMA, but not 100% OUS data and not data that you can't prove was collected where patients received the same medical care as they received in the United States.
Excellent. Thank you for clarifying that, doctor. And speaking of your engagement with partners and colleagues, you lead the cardiovascular strategy and delivery as part of your integrated life cycle model that unifies regulatory, clinical, quality, reimbursement, and even the laboratory services. What does strategy and delivery actually mean in the day-to-day for companies you work with?
So at RQM Plus, I'm the director of cardiovascular strategy and delivery and the co-leader of the Cardiovascular Center of Excellence. The Cardiovascular Center of Excellence is new at RQM Plus. I lead it with Dr. Jayshankar Cuddy. And what our goal is, and this is really part and parcel of what my role is as the strategy person, and that's that we can offer our clients a full package, going from initial clinical and regulatory strategy to the entire pre-submission process or first in human in either the US or Europe. We have boots on the ground in Europe. We have boots on the ground in Latin America, South America. We can take them from those initial studies through to the pivotal, the final, the CE marking studies. We can provide reimbursement. As you said, we also have Geordie Labs that we can provide biocompatibility. And one very exciting aspect of the CV Center of Excellence that we are currently developing is the ability to play a role in preclinical studies. We know that with cardiovascular devices, bench and in vivo studies are critically important. So we are in the process of partnering, for example, with the GLP laboratory, with a laboratory that studies valves, with a laboratory that studies pumps, to be able to provide our clients with a connection to these partners where they can do studies, and we will still play a role in project management and designing the preclinical studies. Is part of my career. I was saying that I've done A to Z in startups. I was always responsible for designing the animal studies, for designing the sterilization validation, for doing the biocompatibility. So we can provide that entire package to our clients.
That's wonderful. A wonderful product, a well-rounded product that takes them from end to end. I'm interested in learning more about that collaboration with labs that are focused on not necessarily the medical side of the device, but rather the mechanical. How did that come about, and what can you share about that strategy?
It came about because Jay and I, who's my partner, were looking at what we could offer with the Cardiovascular Center of Excellence. And what we saw was that very often we would have clients that would come and we would be able to, develop the clinical and regulatory strategy for them. And we would get that put in place. But before they could really take the next step, they had to finish, building the device and testing the device and knowing the device worked. So, they would go off and do that, and we would sort of lose connection until they came back and were ready to actually do first in human, and we could get ethics committee and competent authority approvals and, site set up sites, etc. And we wanted to fill that gap. We wanted to be able to maintain a connection with our clients through that time period. So just from connections that both of us have had in the past, we reached out to some groups and talked to them about what our goals were and how we could have mutual interests, where we might bring clients to the partner and the partner might have clients that are coming to them saying, hey, you're doing this testing for us and here's the testing report. but we don't really know how we're supposed to go to FDA, or we don't really know how we're supposed to do this. So the partner could also bring clients to us. It's important that the partnerships are two-way, um, but that's how it came about, to fill a gap that we saw in our own services. Because as I said, the real goal of the Cardiovascular Center of Excellence is really to be the go-to CRO for cardiovascular devices. And the only way we can do that is to be full service in the true sense of the word.
That makes total sense. Total sense, doctor. Thank you. And speaking of becoming or encompassing that go to mentality, looking ahead over the next few years in cardiovascular innovation, what do you see as the central? How do you see the center of excellence becoming um, a leader in the industry? What is the core impact you want to achieve for the industry, for sponsors, and ultimately for patients who whose lives more often than not depend on those devices reaching the market?
Yeah. Um, I guess the way that I would say it is we want to be able to bring new and innovative technologies, not just to regulatory approval, but to clinical adoption. And we're doing that by having the full service. We're doing that by offering reimbursement services. We're doing that by offering some preclinical relationships. We're also looking at putting together an advisory board of physicians for the Cardiovascular Center of Excellence. So we're looking at bringing in that role that I talked about earlier, where the physician input is important to clinical adoption. It's important to designing studies. It's important to designing devices. And we want to be able to have that overarching source or resource for the Cardiovascular Center of Excellence. I think that to really stay with what's happening in 2026, that you're seeing a big change in cardiovascular devices. I think, you know, originally we were making devices and we were doing things like replacing the heart. So anatomically, we were providing function, we were improving cardiac output. But what we're really seeing now are devices that are modifying physiology, that aren't necessarily life sustaining, but are improving function. So they're more focused on patients feeling better. And in turn, then study designs are becoming more patient centric. And that's part of what the Center of Excellence is prepared to help our clients do, is develop more patient-reported outcomes as important endpoints of studies, not just exploratory. So we're looking at study designs that revolve around how the patient feels, not just is the patient alive after you use the device. And that's critical, not just to the patient, but to third-party payers, to CMS, to everyone. And I think that's the direction that studies are going now. There's also a huge amount of technology coming out in terms of the mechanics by which we can study devices, or by which we can study cardiovascular physiology in our patients. So the onset of remote sensors, the onset of wearable devices, all of those things bring new challenges in terms of study design and particularly in terms of data collection. I was working with one group that had this really cool remote sensor that could measure, all of these things, and the data files were, miles and miles long. But, what do you do with all that data? And is there a workflow at the clinic that can manage that? It's one thing to have a device that can have 900 alarms and tell you all these cool things. But if you have a nurse coordinator at the site who has to deal with 500 patients and 900 alarms, well, you can see how that doesn't work. And developing devices without understanding that, or designing studies where you're collecting that kind of data is not useful, because in the end, what you can put on your label, what you can claim about your device, is only what you studied and proven in your trial. And so your trial has to be appropriately designed. I think the other issue is AI. There's a lot of really interesting stuff happening in AI. So ECGs now, you could look at an ECG now and tell if a patient has amyloidosis or is going to have a heart attack. That's wonderful. But the challenge is, what's the actionable data? So I know that the ECG indicates that there's a good probability, based on all these algorithms, that the patient has X. But what does that mean to me as a physician? What do I do with that information? Does that mean that I need to start treating the patient, or does that mean I need to increase monitoring? Those kinds of things have to be studied and established. Otherwise, these new technologies are not going to last. If you can't get actionable information, then the technologies don't have as much value. And if you can't design clinical studies that allow you to demonstrate what the actionable information is, and that does provide patients with better care, then you also haven't really succeeded. And the expertise and the group that we're building with the CV Center of Excellence, that's what we're all about. That's what we're doing. We want to bring cardiovascular device studies into 2026 and the new millennium, the new era.
Dr. Deborah Morley, thank you so much for sharing this with us today. My biggest takeaway from our conversation has to be how you reframe the sign for adoption from day one. How that's not an option; it's a core mission in this process of bringing new technology to the market. Thank you for sharing your experience, your insights, your strategies with us today. And to our listeners, if you found this episode interesting and it provided value to you, would you please consider subscribing and sharing it with one of your colleagues that is perhaps leading efforts to build the next generation of cardiovascular breakthroughs? Dr. Morley, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
And until next time, keep accelerating.